Good afternoon here in Washington. Good evening to our virtual viewers in Europe. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. This is a very good day for the Atlantic Council and for American understanding of Russia. The Eurasia Center is launching a new series of papers on Russia tomorrow. We're doing this because Russia under Putin poses the greatest short-term threat to the United States. Of course, China is the greater long-term threat because it enjoys a real economy, which Russia does not. And Russia has been signaling this threat for well over a decade. And the U.S. academic community and the political/policy community have been slow to realize it. So with this series of paper, we're going to be taking a close look at Russia, both domestically and foreign policy, in order to draw an accurate picture and the proper conclusions of the danger that Russia represents. We have a paper today that leads us off, written by Casey Michel, a brilliant young American scholar, on the 5 scenarios for Russia's future. But one of the strengths of our program is that we bring into it serious Russian analysts, many associated with the political opposition in Russia, but independent-minded, which means that it's hard for them to work under the Russian think tanks, which ultimately must answer to the Kremlin. So after Casey's paper, which you'll hear about today, we will have Mikhail Zygar writing on Putin's inner circle. And after that, we'll have Vlad Milov writing on Russia's oil and gas industries, and lots more papers to come. So I welcome you, the in-house audience and the virtual audience, for the start of what will be a vigorous academic look into Russia. Brian, over to you.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening to our online viewers in Europe. I'm Brian Whitmore. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council and editor of this Russia Tomorrow series. So what will Russia look like in 10 years, in 15, in 20? How much longer will Vladimir Putin's 2-decade-plus rule last? Who or what will come after him? Will Russia continue its expansionist and anti-Western course, or will it seek rapprochement? Will Russia remain intact, or will it disintegrate like the Soviet Union before it? And how should the United States and our allies prepare for all these contingencies? These questions and more are all addressed in the report we are launching today, 5 Scenarios for Russia's Future by Casey Michel, whom I consider to be one of the most thoughtful and outside-the-box thinkers in the Russia-watching space. And for those of you that don't know Casey's work, he's the director of the Combating Kleptocracy program at the Human Rights Foundation, as well as a writer, analyst, and investigative journalist, working on topics ranging from kleptocracy, illicit finance, dark money, foreign lobbying, foreign interference, and the legacies of Russian and Soviet colonialism. His first book, American Kleptocracy, examined how our country helped enable the corruption and autocracy in the former Soviet space. In his forthcoming book, Foreign Agents, continues to explore along the same theme. Over to you, Casey.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. Out of the box is certainly one of the kindest things I've been called, so I appreciate that. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Before I begin, I want to thank the entire team at the Atlantic Council for hosting this event today, as well as this fantastic series of papers. Very much look forward to reading through, and especially want to thank for the opportunity to author this paper, as well as to discuss this topic that, as far as I'm concerned, is still far too ignored, far too overlooked even after the past few years, and that is the future of Russia. Now, we've obviously spent much of the past few years discussing the future of Ukraine and Kyiv's rightful place in the West, its broader Western trajectory, but we have spent strangely little time discussing what the potential future for Russia entails, let alone what that means for the rest of us. So today, I'd like to talk a little bit about just that, and some of the top-line findings of this paper and some of the contours of Russia's potential and even likely course. But since there's also plenty about that in the paper itself, I would also like to pull back a little bit and talk about some of the clear lessons I found in putting this paper together and how that can help inform some of our strategy moving forward. So, first things first. What are the 5 scenarios that this paper deals with? The first is, unfortunately, the easiest to digest and certainly the likeliest in the short term, and that is Putin's continued rule. With presidential elections upcoming, no organized opposition to be found, apologies to Boris Nadezhdin, and with renewed optimism in Moscow about the war in Ukraine, there is little reason to think that Putin won't continue steering the Kremlin for the foreseeable future. But that is easy to imagine. That's what we've been dealing with for years. In terms of future scenarios, though, from there, things get a little bit murkier. Which brings us to the second scenario, Putin's ouster, followed by the installation of a nationalistic regime or cadre. With a little bit further time horizon, it is easy to envision some kind of redux of Yevgeny Prigozhin's quasi-mutiny, quasi-push, whatever you'd like to call it, from last year. After all of the ingredients are still there. The frustration with Putin's bungled invasion, the continued stripping of Russia of men and material for this quagmire, as well as the kind of spiraling wealth inequality that has launched populists and revolutionaries the world over. It's all still there. And while Prigozhin never made it to Moscow, it wasn't for lack of trying. The way was not that barricaded. As we know, the Kremlin was by and large quite open, and if Prigozhin accomplished anything, and I apologize for this image, he revealed that Putin is a czar with no clothes. Now, those are 2 scenarios. The third scenario also deals with Putin's ouster, or potentially even his death in office, but with a different and far more technocratic regime emerging. Not a democratic one per se, but one that at least admits to broader failures of policy in Ukraine and pledges a return to a kind of status quo antebellum, if only the West will lift its sanctions and its price cap policies. It is a regime that wants, in a term I'm sure we will all be familiar with, what it calls a reset. Now, as you'll see in the paper, this is the scenario I perhaps fear the most, since we will once more end up with Western politicians suckered in by this kind of rhetoric, convinced that Russia has finally changed, all while ignoring all of the lessons we have supposedly learned over the past few decades. Now, the fourth scenario is perhaps the least likely in the short to medium term, but it is also one, and Brian, you and I were talking about this just the other day, I am perhaps being foolishly naive to even consider. And that is one, however, I still feel is guaranteed over a long enough time horizon, and that is Russia's democratic transition, its democratic flowering. I know this is unlikely in the next few years, but even while Navalny and Kara-Murza are languishing in jail, and even while Russia's democratic opposition remains smothered, if we pull back, I do think, at least on my end, it's relatively easy to see how this might end up coming about. After all, this is the story of every other European empire prior. Colonial failures force regimes and polities to give up dreams of empire, and as a result, democratic reforms flourish. This is a story we saw with the United Kingdom, battered by Irish Republicans and Indian patriots. This is a story we saw with the French, undone by Algerian and Vietnamese forces, and it is a story we saw in Portugal after those in Angola and Mozambique finally evicted their former colonizers. And it is a story that we may yet see if, and this is a big if, we do everything we can to help Ukraine beat back Russian invaders and reclaim every square inch of sovereign territory. So those are 4 scenarios. The fifth and final one is something of an inverse of this story of democratic transition, because there is another path that these kinds of colonial legacies can also point to, and which Russia has, perhaps ironically, already dealt with in its past. This is civil war, this is state fracture, and this is, for at least certain colonies still considered part of the Russian Federation, freedom. Now, it's impossible to tell what the spark for this may be. Perhaps it's the death of Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya and the sparking of a third Chechen war. Perhaps it's protests erupting in Tatarstan or in Sakha, directed at Putin's war machine and predicated on colonial legacies that have never been dealt with. Or perhaps it's something else entirely, which we still can't see coming because we are so focused on Moscow, and because so many of those of us that follow Russia generally speak only Russian, and we don't speak Tatar or Sakha or Chechen. which means we're going to miss this until it's right on top of us. Now, this fifth scenario is an outcome, perhaps an out-of-the-box one, that many of us still refuse to treat and still refuse to consider. But it is one that, thanks to Putin's policies and Russia's refusal to even recognize itself as a colonial power, is increasingly likely. And frankly, the more I dive into the myriad histories of Russia's internal colonies, the more inescapable it becomes. The more I read of anti-Russian pogroms in Tuva in the 1990s, the more I read about the broken pledges of sovereignty to Tatarstan under Boris Yeltsin, the more I read about the unfulfilled promises of an independent army for Sakha, all while it is stripped of its natural wealth, the more you realize these tensions are just waiting for a moment to return. And the more you realize these legacies may be out of sight, but they are not out of mind. So those are the 5 scenarios, and the paper has much more about that. Now, I'm sure we'll be talking about all of these in today's conversation, but with just a few final minutes, I did want to discuss one of the clearest lessons that I've certainly learned in putting this paper together. And that is we can no longer afford the kinds of failures of imagination that we have experienced over and over again for decades about what is in store for Moscow and the Russian Federation as a whole. Now, this goes all the way back to the late Cold War. I just finished off a separate paper looking at the century-long history of U.S. policy regarding Ukraine, including the late 1980s, early 1990s. And even though I knew much of this history, I was still absolutely floored, as I often am, about how staggeringly blind Washington was to the Soviet dissolution in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And again, this is no one's fault. This was across the board. You even had figures like Brent Scowcroft, who is right about so much else, as late as, I think, December 1990, saying the Ukrainians would never leave the Soviet Union. They would never vote themselves out. You could count on one hand the number of people that correctly saw the Soviet crack-up coming, and that's only one chapter. I don't need to tell you how many people failed to imagine Putin's authoritarianism, or the invasion, or even the fact that the Ukrainians would fight back as much as they did. It is this constant failure of imagination that has led us to dead end after dead end and has kept us on the back foot for decades. It has kept us reactive, and it has led directly to disaster. Which is why now, right now, is the perfect time to flex these kinds of muscles that we haven't used in years. Now is the inflection point. Now is the pivot point for everything that comes next. Look at where we are in Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia has lost more troops, magnitudes more troops, than the Soviets lost in Afghanistan, more than in all the wars that Moscow has been involved in since World War II. In just the last 6 or 7 months, we saw again, unprecedented mutiny or putsch, whatever you want to call it, in which a renegade militia nearly marched on Moscow. We saw rampaging anti-Semitic riots in which security services were nowhere to be found. And in just the past few weeks, we've seen protests erupt in Bashkortostan, linked in part to Russia's colonial legacies. Now, following the day-to-day news cycle, as I'm sure all of us do, as we well should, it's easy to forget all of this and to forget just how destabilized Putin's regime suddenly is. It is difficult at times to even imagine it, which is what I hope this paper will help us do, as well as the series of papers that are set to come out. Instead of focusing on the infighting in Washington and Brussels, instead of focusing on the small movements along the front line in Ukraine, instead of focusing on Putin's looming re-election, even though these are all obviously important topics, I am hoping that this paper will help us take a beat and assess where we are and where we're going. Because it's only in imagining these potential futures that we can prepare accordingly, and it's only in considering what comes next, what can come next, what will come next, that we can, for the first time in a very long time, finally be prepared. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Casey. I told you he was an outside-the-box thinker. He didn't disappoint, did he? And I'd like to add that each of these scenarios have contingencies. They're very well spelled out in the paper, and we can kind of flesh them out if people are interested in that in the Q&A. But first, I want to introduce our excellent panel here. With us online is Angela Stent, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a senior advisor at the United States Institute of Peace, and the one and only Evgeny Albatz, the Walter Shorenstein Media and Democracy Fellow at Harvard University. And of course, sitting with us here at the table is Ambassador John Herbst, who is of course the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and the former United States Ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan. I wanted to kind of open it up with one question that I want to ask everybody. And I'm being a little selfish here because this is something I'm kind of struggling with myself, actually, as we look through the prospects of change in Russia. And the question is this. Many of us look at Russia and we see a web of entrenched patron-client networks, a deeply seated political culture of autocratic rule and arbitrary rule, a lack of viable institutions, the absence of the rule of law, a weak civil society, and we come to the conclusion that nothing meaningful will ever really change. We see a Russia that's remained in its essence, in the essence of oligarchic rule, in the essence of its form of government, the very same. From medieval Muscovy to the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union to the present-day Russian Federation. The external forms may have changed, but the essence of arbitrary oligarchic rule has remained the same. We made this mistake in 1991. Do we risk making this mistake again, mistaking kind of changing of the facade for a changing of the essence, as we did in 1991? Do we risk making this mistake when Putin departs the scene? Or conversely, does the deep-seated cynicism that I just expressed risk dismissing real change should it actually come? Yevgeny and Angela, you're both sitting there patiently as we're all yapping over here, so I want to actually go to you. Yevgeny, why don't we start with you? Do we risk mistaking fake change for real change? Or does the cynicism risk missing real change should it come?
Brian, thank you very much for your question, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this panel. To be honest with you, I think that we're yet to do a good due diligence. We're yet to understand what happened in Russia. And I think it's a little bit too early to jump in all those scenarios. Of course, I understand that less you know, the easier it is to make predictions. But I think that the most important thing now is first to understand what did happen. Why Russia could evolve into, of course, it was pretty easy to expect it to evolve into authoritarian rule, but none of us, or many of us, didn't expect Russia to get into full-scale war with the rest of the world, first with Ukraine and preparing for the war with NATO and etc. So I think that's most important thing to do. I read through the paper. I find all those scenarios not plausible. But I guess, once again, as I said, I don't know how to read the crystal ball, but I do understand clearly that lack of understanding of the past leads to the mistake in the future. Lack of understanding of the institutional setup of the Soviet Union led to the mistakes of the 1990s, with respect to the kind of reforms that were advised from the West, with respect to the kind of risks that were foreseen back then in early 1990s. And I'm afraid that we may go into the same trap now. If we start with, with all kind of, these imaginary scenarios, as opposed to studying the past and contemporary reality. Thank you.
Casey, I wanted to give you a chance to respond there before I kind of move on with this question to the other panelists.
Thanks, Brian. No, look, I think that it's a point well taken. If we don't understand where we are, we don't understand where we've been, we won't understand where we're going. Certainly my argument within this paper is that we have seen plenty of focus on where we are, and I would argue certainly plenty of focus on where we have been, and even mining recent history for lessons learned. The problem then being that still leaves us in a reactive rather than a proactive state, and obviously the point of the paper itself is to outline potential scenarios moving forward that will help inform our current understanding, as well as provide some agility, some nimbleness, both in the policy space as well as in the broader strategic space where Russia is going moving forward. I certainly think some of the scenarios are perhaps more more plausible than others in the near term, although I don't know that I agree that they are all implausible.
I'm gonna drill down on which ones are more or less plausible when we go forward. I want to bring Angela Stent into the conversation here. Angela, you were in government the last time we went through a change in Russia. How do we distinguish between real change and superficial change that's just on the surface? Do we risk the problem of essentialism, saying that Russia will never change, or does this cynicism lead us to missing real change? How do you see this? I think you're muted, Angela.
Well, thank you for including me in this discussion. I think the first point to make is just to emphasize again, it's very hard to understand what's happening in Russia or how the Russian system functions from the outside. And I think even from the inside, it's difficult for some Russians, although they maybe understand it instinctively. And I think it was Gleb Pavlovsky who said, those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. So we put that aside. Also, thinking about this question reminded me of my former Harvard professor, Edward Keenan, and his brilliant article, Muscovite Political Folkways. And indeed, you're right, Brian. You can go back to the medieval times, and you look at this system where a few men ruled the country. They understood what the rules were until those rules changed. They made sure that even if they had a weak czar, to make the outside world think it was a strong czar. And of course, this was autocratic rule with really no civil liberties. And you've had cycles throughout Russian history when this breaks down, there's a revolt, peasants, whatever, things change for a while, but then the system always comes clawing back. And that obviously is what happened. You had this flowering late Gorbachev and early Yeltsin of much more pluralism and a breakdown of this autocratic system. And then, of course, it came crawling back or clawing back, and we see it now. What should we look for, for signs of real change? I mean, I consider myself maybe a realistic optimist, and that is, I don't think that Russia is doomed always to have this kind of government, although history has to make one very, very cautious about this. I think the mistake we made in 1991 in the West was thinking that, communism was gone and Russians wanted freedom, they wanted democracy, they wanted something completely different, and we thought this was going to happen, very quickly. I think partly, and this comes back to the policymakers, because, the Clinton administration knew it was going to be in office maybe for 4 years, or 8 years, and it wanted all these changes to happen quickly while it was in office. And of course, it takes a very long time for these changes to take root. I don't know which we can talk about which one of these scenarios is more likely. I do think that and I think these would just go until 2030. I think it's highly likely that Putin will be in power till 2030. We can talk about the other ones afterwards, but I think the kinds of things we'd have to look for if there was a change in government is obviously how it occurred, and clearly who took over. And if there was, say, a power struggle following something happening, then I think that would be also very difficult to figure out how this was going on. So we are more bystanders in that kind of scenario.
Thank you, Angela. I'm delighted that you quoted Professor Edward Keenan. I think everybody should read Muscovite Political Folkways if they haven't. I also want to kind of bring in Gleb Pavlovsky. He's been quoted here several times. He once said, when Putin falls, he'll fall in one day, and he'll be replaced by something exactly like him. John, I wanted you to kind of weigh in on this question of essentialism and real versus fake change, surface change versus a change of essence. Your thoughts on that?
Look, I don't think we should deny the differences between the Soviet Union and Putin's Russia. The mobilization of the Soviet people under Stalin and his successors was a massive effort which included evil on an historic scale whether you talk about the brutalities of collectivization, of the purges, and of other things that came after that. Putin is kind of a Stalin mini-me. But, and Russia today is not as dangerous to the world, at least in terms of capacity, as the Soviet Union was. But it is true that the certain forms of Russian political culture, going back centuries, characterize both Soviet power and Putin's Russia power. The opaqueness of decision-making, the relatively small number of hands that play a role, the use of massive public information campaigns and repression to achieve regime goals and to keep those outside of power, those things remain. And understanding that, that means in terms of foreign policy, because Putin has returned to an aggressive foreign policy. And in fact, Putin is a greater risk taker than Stalin ever was, which makes him, in that respect, more dangerous than Stalin. We need to be prepared for this. Now, I can relate this conversation, or I can take this conversation and talk about Russia's future, but maybe this is not the time to do that. Well, if you decide. You're the moderator.
It's up to you, John.
I'm just a panelist.
You're the boss.
No. You're the boss in this event. I'm just a speaker.
Well, we can drill into this as we go forward. Casey, I know you and I have discussed this in the podcast this week. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, look, obviously it's a key and in many ways unanswerable question insofar as what are we actually talking about, as it pertains to Russian essentialism. Does that include populations like those in Chechnya? Does that include populations like those in Tatarstan or Sakha? But maybe we'll table that for right now. I do think it might be worth including consideration, conversation. We're talking about historical analogies. We're talking about historical precedents and certainly patterns that continue to play out vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, vis-a-vis the Russian Federation itself. I do think it's worth considering, certainly as I've written elsewhere, comparativist approach to other imperial and post-imperial states and legacies as well. And I can't help thinking that if we were having this conversation, Brian, and not necessarily 20 or 25 years ago, but if we were sitting in, at this table in Washington here in 1935, and we were having conversations about the kind of immutability, the maybe invincibility of this notion of Russian totalitarianism out of Moscow, whatever form, whatever guise it may take, I think a lot of folks would look around the table and say, yes, that's all fine and good. Yes, that's all fine and true. We might as well say the same thing about Berlin. We might as well say the same thing about Lisbon. We might as well say the same thing about Spain. Obviously, there have been substantial geopolitical developments since 1935, all of which is to say, though, it does seem, maybe to paraphrase Mr. Pavlovsky, essentialism appears true until one day it's not.
It's not, yeah. Yeah, and these same discussions, as you correctly point out, were once made about Germany. That Germany will never change.
Or that the German people will never support democracy because it's not in their, political culture, political DNA, pick your term.
No, the reason I ask this question is because this is something everybody that knows me knows this is something I struggle with. This problem of essentialism is important. I want to direct the next, going into the second round of questions, to John and Angela, both because you both have served in government. Imagine, if you will, a world in which Putin is replaced by a, for lack of a better term, more pluralistic regime, be it technocratic or liberal. How cautious or how bold should the United States and its allies be in response? Should we give them the benefit of the doubt, or should we follow kind of to twist on Ronald Reagan's famous distrust but verify, or trust but verify? How quickly should we move to lift sanctions and return to business as usual? Should we return to business as usual at all? What should the benchmarks be? What were the lessons we learned from the last period of apparent Russian political change in the late 80s and early 1990s? John, would you start with that, and I want to then go to Angela on that.
I was working in the part of the department responsible for the entire post-Soviet area, SNIS, from 94 to 97. And a partial bet, and thank God it was only a partial bet, was made on the concept that Russia was, as much as all the other nations that emerged from the Soviet rubble, a victim of communism, and that Russia would be a good partner for us. And a very energetic effort was made to pursue that vision, as seen by the aid program that we pushed with Russia, as seen by our welcoming Russia into ultimately the G7, as seen by the development of the NATO-Russian relationship. But as I say, it was a partial bet. There was a large debate within the administration, much of which has been captured in several excellent books on the subject. And ultimately, a second school of thought won the debate regarding NATO enlargement. In part, that reflected the ardent efforts of the Warsaw Pact states to get into the NATO tent because they feared Kremlin revisionism. And American politics played into that. But in part, even some folks who had always been associated with a softer approach towards Moscow, even in Soviet times, my ex-boss Strobe Talbot, understood that a hedge against bad Russian historic practice was not a bad thing. And thank God we went down that road. Otherwise, the war we might be focusing on today would be in Poland rather than in Ukraine. So I think that kind of understanding is extremely relevant to the conversation we're having today. And let me just make one more point regarding Russian essentialism. I think that truly history is the best guide to the future, but not the only guide. And in fact, the point that Casey made regarding doubts regarding Germany's ability to be a democracy circa 1945, as evidenced by the Morgenthau Plan, which thank God was not implemented, demonstrates that. So if you accept history as your guide, you just say, well, the nasty governance that has characterized Russia for centuries is what we should expect going forward, including that foreign policy component. And it's worth pointing out that it was, in theory, Moscow's greatest historian, Khrushchevsky, who said something like, when the Russian people suffer, Russia marches abroad, making the connection between internal authoritarianism and external aggression. Having said all that, let me throw out an insight which pushes very hard in the other direction. I don't think the Russian people and the Russian elite are stupid. Let's start with that. And I suspect that if you look at how the world works today, a country will only prosper if it opens itself up to interchange across global society, especially global economy. And to do that effectively, you have to open up opportunities for your people, and you can't micromanage either the politics of your nation or the economy of your nation. And I think there are a lot of Russians who understand that. And if they do understand that there's no way Russia could remain a great power unless it adapts to this new reality, you can see the path towards a liberal, somewhat liberal, less illiberal, less aggressive Russia in the future. And let me throw out the think tanker in Moscow, who I've continued to quote, although he's currently in his Neanderthal stage. And that's Dmitry Trenin. At the same time I took this job, which was almost 10 years ago, I read a book he wrote circa 2002. And it was something like Goodbye to Eurasia. And he basically laid out this dreadful historic pattern of Russian governance and aggressive Russian foreign policy. He said, we've got to stop this stuff if we want to be great. Now, of course, he wrote that shortly before the unpleasantness began in Ukraine, going back to the Orange Revolution. And there was a 180-degree turn, or 80-degree, 90-degree turn in Moscow in the wrong direction. Trenin then rewrote that book without the core element of it. And of course, now he's in his full Neanderthal stage, reflecting the political circumstances in Russia. That's why I say this type of thinking is seen in circles in Russia where we don't necessarily expect to see enlightenment. But Evgenia knows more about this than I. Maybe she can say this is all fanciful thought.
Yeah, no, I tend to look at Trenton as kind of a barometer. He was saying
exactly.
what he was supposed to say in the
Right.
90s, and now he's saying what he's supposed to say
Right.
now. I'd also like to add, before going to Angela, my generation kind of suffers from what I call the "we won't get fooled again" syndrome. We got all excited about perestroika. We got all excited about political change. We thought the end of history and all. And now we're not going to get fooled again. And I'm always trying to check myself against being overly cynical. Angela, your thoughts on this, imagining, if you will, this scenario where a more pluralistic regime comes into power in Russia. How cautious, how cynical, what should the benchmarks be for us?
Well, again, you were quoting President Reagan before, trust but verify. Before I answer that, I just did want to say to Casey that I would be wary of making historical analogies with the British and the French empires. After all, France and Great Britain were democracies while they held colonies. So the loss of empire, yes, it was difficult for them, but it didn't entail major changes in their domestic systems too. So, I would agree with John that clearly any intelligent Russian technocrat understands that the real task at hand, which Putin has completely avoided, is to modernize Russia, is to build institutions that work, is to be less dependent on hydrocarbon exports, to build up other industries. And in order to do that, and Alexei Kudrin said this before the war began, certainly, you have to have pretty good ties with the West. You have to be integrated into the global system. And this is what will be good for the Russian people. But having said that, if we look at this hypothetical technocratic government that's going to come in, look at some of the key technocrats that we all knew: German Gref, Elvira Nabiullina, Alexei Kudrin, and let's say even Sergei Kiriyenko. And all of these people, despite the fact that they were part of this global elite and understood, what was happening, the need for global integration, they have all buckled down since this war began and done what they had to do. Whether it's Nabiullina pursuing economic policies that she wouldn't have pursued before to save the ruble, whether it's Gref, and even with Kiriyenko, he's now in charge of the occupied territories in Ukraine. So that even these technocrats can lose sight of that because of the bargain that they made with Putin. Okay, so in this scenario now, Putin's gone. So the first thing is to be extremely cautious, not to, you'd have to wait and see what their policies are. And I think, as Casey says in this scenario, they wouldn't be liberal anymore, but at least they might understand that they have to have better ties with the West. And so you have to be cautious. I think you have to put some feelers out. And then if you believe that, in fact, they are moving in a less anti-Western direction, then you might begin to lift some of the sanctions. You're not going to lift all of them immediately. I mean, there might be an argument to lift the financial sanctions early, including the exclusion from the SWIFT system, in order for the Russian economy to be able to operate better. And, if you think about it, all these Russians who can't use their credit cards, and, it's been harder for the economy to function. But I certainly wouldn't remove all of the sanctions at once. And what would the benchmarks be? Well, I think a key benchmark would be how they treat their people. Do they release political prisoners? I agree with Casey that this kind of technocratic government, they wouldn't release Alexei Navalny, and they would still be nationalist, but at least release all these political prisoners who've been jailed for their mild protests, in some cases, against the war. Then I think and then in general, are they enabling civil society to open up? Can Russians once again communicate with each other in ways that have been much more difficult to do during this war? What about the internet? Those kinds of things. In other words, the way they treat their own people, the way they interact with the outside world. I guess the assumption in this scenario is that once this technocratic government is in power, Russia will have withdrawn from the occupied territories in Ukraine. I don't know quite what that would look like, because we don't know how the war is going to end, but at least the war would be over. one would certainly have to look at that. And then I think another thing you would do is to put out some feelers to engage in a dialogue on issues like strategic stability, which the Putin regime now won't talk about, because that's something that's in our interest, but it's, of course, in Russia's interest too. And it is a forum, strategic stability talks, where we get together as equals, and it's something that that would be, I think, very advisable. But I think one would have to be cautious because, as you said, Brian, you don't want to get fooled again, and you also don't want to too soon get rid of the sanctions before you know whether this government will move in the right direction. And I think the final point to make that we often forget is we have to always remember, and this was a mistake in the early 90s, we see the world very differently than Russians do. And we have to not only understand that, we have to also put ourselves, to the extent that we can, in their frame, and try and imagine how they see things in the outside world. And I think that will inform our actions better.
Thank you. And we're going to go very shortly to questions. I want to kind of bring one more back to Yevgenia. And I want to remind those online, you can ask questions at askac.org. A couple of them are coming here across on my little device here. Yevgenia, I want to go to you with this next question. More than a century ago, Pavel Milyukov famously said that Russian liberalism stops at the Ukrainian border. In a scenario in which Putin is replaced by a more liberal successor, do you see the imperial impulse remaining? Because, of course, Milyukov was a minister in the government that came to power, the liberal government that came to power after the 1917 revolution. Do you see this imperial impulse remaining, or would a defeat in Ukraine deal the decisive blow to Russia's imperial instincts?
Right, thank you very much. I will have had time to understand what you mean, guys, by imperial impulse. Obviously, it is part of the Putin's current foreign policy and his desire to reinstate the Tsarist Empire, not the USSR, but the Tsarist Empire. So, therefore, people who will come after him, first of all, we sort of, it's very interesting. We talk as if we speak somewhere on the moon. There is an elephant in the room, which all of you somehow avoid to mention. And it is to say that the outcome of this war in Europe and eventually the outcome of the kind of regime which evolved in Russia much depends upon the US support to Ukraine. As of now, we see that, just last week, the Russians once again bombed Ukrainian cities. But for the first time in almost a year, there were victims, casualties in Kyiv. It is to say that Ukrainians are lacking patriots now to protect their skies over the capital. The kind of weapons that they received, many of them are rusted and they cannot use. They're lacking shells. It's been already 2 years of all this chit chat about upcoming delivery of F-16. In a year, it is a year as there are talks about ATACMS. I do understand that probably there is this idea to bleed Russian economy, Russian military industrial complex as much as possible. And Ukrainians are paying with their own lives for that desire. However, unfortunately, I think that it is a very dangerous game which is played now. Putin is bluffing, and he's extremely successful bluffer. he's capable to convince not just those who are stuck to Russian propaganda TV. It's obvious, but even Russians are now sort of waking up from all this propaganda bluffing. However, I read in the American newspapers and in the European newspapers that they are also sort of succumb to this Putin's bluffing, that he's winning, that Ukraine is unable to win this war, that it's time to start negotiations because otherwise it's going to be much worse. And there are talks, Angela Stan, just in her recent interview to Bloomberg, said that there were 4 meetings between, parties with respect to those plausible negotiations. I also know that there are envoys sent to different capitals, the Washington, D.C. included, as saying that Putin is ready for some truce, for some ceasefire. And if Ukrainians are not going to go for that now, and by saying Ukrainians, they also mean that United States is supposed to tell Zelensky what to do, then it's going to be much worse 3 months from now or 6 months from now. So we, for those of us who, observers of the Russian politics, both from outside and inside, we do understand that Putin's economy is in dead trouble, that even though he has managed to put on track many of the Soviet Union's military-industrial complex plants, still they don't have enough facilities and, more importantly, enough parts to produce as many weapons as they needed at the front lines. There are problems with chips. Russian soldiers are now, supplied with rifles made in 1946. As Bill Burns acknowledged in his recent essay published by the Foreign Affairs, Russians lost 2/3 of the tanks, and they cannot reproduce as many of them now. So it is in Putin's goal to get a break in order for a year or so, in order to bring more. In order to for Russian economy to create.
Yeah, Yevgeny, I want to take this to questions.
I'm sorry, somebody's just trying to reach me from Russia. Anyway, so that's what's really important, I think. But to really, I'm sorry, when Angela, when you say we're not going to allow ourselves to fool us again. Wait a second, you fooled yourself. You're yourself by building, the. I'm sorry, I have to.
Okay, Yevgeny, I need to take it to questions now because we only have 10 minutes left in the event. So I need to take this to questions now. John, I know you had a very brief remark, or should I just go to the audience?
Just go to questions.
Okay, yeah. Yes, Ariel. Mike.
AskAC.org.
Ask AC. Yeah, I got them.
Yeah, start there.
Oh, start there. Okay. All right, well, I'm going to take the first question I'm going to take from my former boss at Radio Free Europe, Jeff Trimble, and he said, why not imagine a scenario in which an aging Putin is shunted aside by an ambitious younger version of himself from within the current power structure and supported by the powers behind the throne, and things pretty much carry on as today. That's an interesting scenario that wasn't among your 5, Casey?
It absolutely is. The paper deals with 5 scenarios, but they are no means meant to be exhaustive. I mean, God knows there are plenty of other scenarios thereafter. That's certainly one to consider, potentially for future authors or policymakers themselves. It would be fascinating. Again, bringing this back to comparativist models, obviously that seems to be a model that we saw even as recently as a few years ago in Kazakhstan. We can certainly mine that for lessons. Moving forward, I would say that any kind kind of replacement for Putin, regardless of their, well, should they be propelled by similar conspiratorial nationalistic bents? I certainly suppose that it would be a continuation of business as usual, but I have a more difficult time seeing the kind of buy-in from the inner circle, certainly those that are familiar with what kind of devastating impact the war has already had on the Russian body politic as well as the Russian economy.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's the Putinism without Putin argument. Ariel, I wanted to go to you. You had the first hand up. So, oh, it's going to be online. I don't see it online.
Start with another one.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, all right. What does Russia's future mean for those countries like Estonia, Georgia, et cetera, today? How can thinking about Russia's future better inform the foreign policies forged not just in Washington, but also Tallinn and Tbilisi? I think this one's tailor-made for you, John, as you served as ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan.
Okay, thank you. I just want to comment before I answer that. I think Yevgeny made very strong points, which were not necessarily part of this panel, but we've been working on hard for the Atlantic Council for the last several years. So her analysis of the need for American support is absolutely right. And how Russia's celebrating the problems in the US Congress. Okay, on your question, look, as it turns out, all the quote-unquote sophisticated thinkers in Western Europe and the United States who for decades have poo-pooed the concerns expressed by our Baltic friends and our Polish friends and our Romanian friends have proved to be wrong. And some of them have been sufficiently self-confident to acknowledge it. The point is, they understood what Putin was up to long before chancelleries in Europe and governmental institutions in the United States understood. Because their very lives as independent nations depend upon a clear-eyed analysis of what's going on in Moscow. So if we were smart, we would listen more closely to them today, including on such important issues as Ukraine joining NATO. And there's been a partial recognition in Washington and other capitals about failings of previous policy, but only partial. If there were full recognition, the points Yevgeny was making about getting American weapons in large supply and more sophisticated versions to Ukraine would not be an issue. We'd just be doing it.
Mm-hmm. Casey, you have experience also in other non-Russian republics of the former Soviet Union. You worked as a Peace Corps volunteer in Kazakhstan. You spent time in other republics. Any thoughts on this question?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think John's point is absolutely well taken. I certainly don't think it's limited to voices or policymakers in Washington, certainly including Berlin and Paris, who have hopefully been sufficiently chastened at this point. But I do think that is a lesson that will not be forgotten for the foreseeable future. I think this gets back to the kind of potential post-Putin regime of saying, look, we can get back to business as usual. Won't you just believe us? Look at what we're saying, not so much what we're doing. I frankly don't have much more to add beyond what John just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I would have. We should listen very closely to what Russia's neighbors say. And I'm actually getting Ariel Cohen's question virtually here. Why democracy in Germany and France, which were occupied by the Allies, is even relevant to Russia? No discussion of China pulling Russia into its gravitational pull. So, is the question of Germany and France actually relevant given the conditions after the Second World War there, occupation? And what about China pulling Russia into its orbit? China's kind of been the elephant in the room here that we haven't really discussed.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great question. Obviously, any historic comparison is not without pitfalls. Nothing is one-to-one. At the same token, obviously, other former empires, most especially in Portugal and Spain, went without American or Western occupation, or at least in the Portuguese case, and nonetheless went through that transition itself. I do think the China question is something we have not talked about today. And I know there have been kind of burbling, gurgling discussions about the role of Russia as transitioning to a supposedly junior partner of China itself. I think in the third scenario, I believe I deal with that in the paper, as something that post-Putin officials can deal with as kind of a rhetorical cudgel, saying, look, we know you don't want us to become a junior partner of China. Why won't you let us do what we want domestically as well as in our quote-unquote near abroad, so long as we promise and pledge to not be Beijing's junior partner? Frankly, that might be a different paper unto itself at some point.
Thank you. And I think Dan Fried is the next.
Yeah. This is a first-rate discussion, and thank you for it. I want to tease out some of John Herbst's lessons from the 90s. There was, and the 80s, there was a skepticism in Washington about whether Gorbachev was, quote, for real. The essentialists were in the majority. Reagan overruled them because he saw the possibility of working with Gorbachev. The essentialists said communism never changes and we're suckers. So that is a cautionary lesson. The scenario you said you feared the most was replacement of Putin by a technocratic regime. You fear it because it would sucker us into premature concessions. I get that, but I don't share it because I lived through those debates. You know, John and I were on the veterans of the old Soviet desk at State. I went through the debates about Gorbachev, and what we did with him was incremental, and we weren't intending to see the end of the Soviet Union, but it ended up very well. However, and John referred to this, what we did not do, not in the 90s, is sacrifice the Central and East Europeans on the altar of good relations with post-Soviet Russia. And that was the debate about NATO enlargement. And it's obvious where I'm going. Much depends on what happens in Ukraine. The way you deal with a post-Putin Russia is whether they are out of Ukraine. And if they come to us and say, well, we have to neutralize it or we'll never prevail against the hardliners in Russia, no deal. But don't rule out incremental approaches with a new regime. This is living memory to the old people, all right? But watch out, Brian's absolutely right to be wary of essentialism. Radical change is the norm in Russian politics for the last 40 years, and we shouldn't rule it out. And last thought, I promise, we should not, Yeltsin failed because we were wrong about Russia being liberated from communism. It was a post-imperial trauma. But if Russia fails in Ukraine, it may be that Russian nationalism is discredited and the blame will go to Putin. So there is hope, but first, help the Ukrainians win.
From your lips to God's ears on that last point, Dan. John, I want to, since this was addressed to you, I'd actually like to bring you and Angela in, actually, because you're both in government.
I agree with Dan's very, very historically grounded comments and conclusion. And I just want to use this opportunity to do something I should have done at the start. The problem of aggressive Russian foreign policy should be item one in our national security agenda. And we need to understand the war in Ukraine as, in fact, a subset of this problem. And to make this all the clearer, on February 14, along with another 10 or so think tanks in Washington, we're convening a conference on Capitol Hill, urging a policy of containment for Putin's Russia. So we invite everyone to that event to hammer home essentially some of the points that Yevgeny made regarding the danger from Moscow and the need to make sure that Putin is thwarted in Ukraine.
We literally have about 2 minutes to a hard stop, but I did want to bring Angela Stent in to respond to Ambassador Fried's remarks because you also were in government at this time.
Yeah, so I was in government when Putin came to power. And so we had all these discussions. I mean, he'd been prime minister, but then, when he was made president, who is he? And in the beginning, you have to remember that he looked as if he wanted better relations with the West. He met with the head of the World Bank. He met with other people, how can we get along better? He made the speech in Berlin, which was very forward-looking. And I think at that point, we were all open to seeing him as a younger, healthier leader of Russia who might, in fact, bring it forward and modernize it. Turned out that we were wrong. I mean, the question is, should we have seen it then? Could we have seen it then? Did he change? Was he always like that? But I think, no, I think Dan Fried is completely right that it's not very helpful to be an essentialist and that you have to, be cautious, but give the new government, whatever it is, a chance to prove itself.
Thank you, Angela. And we actually, that is like perfect timing. 3, 2, 1. We're done. I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank our excellent panelists, and first and foremost, Casey Michelle, who's the author of this great report. I should know I edited it, and I barely had to touch it. So I recommend everybody read this, and I look forward to future papers in this series. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.